an elevator will climb that cable all the way out to the satellite. And then from the satellite, because you're outside the majority of the Earth's gravity, you use a very, very small amount of energy to shoot it out into the solar system. Yeah.
The amount of waste we have right now would cover a football field 12 feet deep.
The amount of high-level waste we have would cover a football field 12 feet deep. And I think that's probably an underestimate. That must be the spent fuel rods or something.
Yeah, spent fuel rods.
That's spent fuel?
Yeah.
And is that just the U.S.?
That's just in the U.S.
That's just the U.S. Will you text message me that?
Like that? Yeah.
How come we don't just like find like a really deep oil well that's been completely like sucked up and just put it in there?
You know, like, it's actually really hard to find a place that's isolated from the biosphere. It's not as simple as one might change. Especially because we still have to be able to go down there and look at it. Don't forget that if you're not there to keep it safe, it'll keep heating up until stuff starts to melt.
Really? Wait. So how come we're not like having other reactors and stuff?
Because it's not that reliable for a nuclear reaction. It's all this stuff. All these radioactive products. It's not splitting the atom, it's giving off radiation now, and it loses its neutrons. Okay, I have to move on. Number 50, why not nukes? Gets 1 star and goes with 42. Um, 51 about ethanol. I think we've already talked about the problems of ethanol, but that's a 2-star study goal. And number 52 about energy efficiency programs, what we call megawatt programs, that is 3 stars. Okay. Now, I would like to finish numbers 41 and 42 about radioactivity and nuclear power. Did we talk about low-level, mid-level, and high-level radioactive waste yesterday? Okay. So, like I was saying earlier, our current plan for high-level radioactive waste is we have no plan. According to Connor's research, the U.S. has enough spent fuel rods to cover a football field 12 feet deep. And that stuff is highly, highly radioactive. Much more radioactive, much more dangerous than a naturally occurring uranium was in the first place. Remember that until we find the right environment to store and monitor this waste, we're still making more waste. There was an idea once that we could vitrify the waste. That means turn it into glass. And essentially, you just wrap the fuel rods in glass. Like a Jell-O mold, a big lump of Jell-O with chunks of banana in it. You'd make a big chunk of glass, like the size of this room, with a couple barrels of fuel rods in the middle. The good news is you can make glass that isolates radioactivity, and that glass that thick is pretty sturdy, like it might last a few 100,000 years. So it makes it much easier to store and monitor the waste. The flip side is we're talking really fancy glass, and it takes a lot of energy to make huge blocks of glass. So vitrification is currently a concept, not a realistic alternative. We also thought we found a place in Nevada where we were going to dig a hole under a mountain. It was called Yucca Mountain. Then we found out there was an earthquake fault underneath the mountain, and that there was 2 separate layers of groundwater in between where they were going to put the holes to do all the storage. So it turned out to be a bad idea, and we went back to the drawing board, which is essentially an empty drawing board.
I don't know if you would know that it's going back to that thing, but why can't we just put it all in Chernobyl?
You're not the first person to mention that. The problem is you have to monitor the stuff.
Why can't we monitor it?
Because who's going to go into Chernobyl?
Well, how about the robot?
Okay. So that is the reason, though, that we fear that humans may need to get there someday. And so this brings me to number 42, which is the current status of the nuclear power debate. I have 2 separate opinions. On one hand, I think nuclear power is probably one of our best sources of energy, because in the good column, the list is really long why we could do nuclear power. Nuclear power is awesome. No CO2. Little or no acid rain / smog. Minimal land impact. Minimal water impact. Scalable power plants. So you can make a little teeny one for a small town and a big old one for a big town. And by the way, we will eventually run out of uranium, but not for a long time. We have hundreds of years of uranium around. So there are many arguments in favor of nuclear power. On the other hand, people who love nuclear power say it's the cheapest electricity, and technically, per unit of electricity, it is the cheapest, but if you count the life cycle of the power plant, like building it and tearing it down after everything inside is radioactive, it's the most expensive. Since society usually has to bear much burden for the construction and decommissioning, the electricity looks cheap, but the power plants are extremely expensive, especially on the cleanup side. There is, of course, the fear of terrorism, which, depending on who you ask, may be a major obstacle or just a minor one. And number 3, the best way I can explain this is I have a fear of commitment. Humanity has never done anything for more than a few thousand years. The longest living human artifacts are like spear points that we carved like 10 to 15,000 years ago. The longest lived human structures are like the pyramids, 4,500 years, maybe. The Incas and the Mayas and the Aztecs were younger than that, I believe. There's like those little rock lines that were drawn by those Andeans. That might have been more than 4,000, I don't remember, years ago. But we're talking a few thousand years. The oldest languages are a few thousand years. The oldest religions are a couple thousand years. The oldest government is under 1,000 years. The United States, considered to be exceptionally old and stable, is like 240 years old. What's that? Right. And my point is, we've already made stuff that will be dangerous to all life on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and we're saying, don't worry about it, I got this. But really, do we got this? Imagine someone says, yes, don't worry, my pet tiger will never escape out of my house. It lives forever. You would say, well, even if you can keep it in the house for now, you don't live forever, bro. And you'd be nervous about this pet tiger. I personally am really nervous about nuclear waste because we've never done anything as a species for hundreds of thousands of years. I hope you understand my point, that maybe humans will go extinct before all this fuel becomes a radioactivity nightmare, but after we've gone extinct, it'll still be a radioactivity nightmare. We are creating problems that could very realistically outlast us, and we haven't created the solution to that problem. I have great faith in humanity and in engineering and in science and creative thinking and in your generation, but I wish we'd had the answer before we allowed ourselves to earn the problem.
Well, didn't you say that most of environmental science is about preserving, like, human?
Yeah. So if we're,
Sure.
So if we're gone, then do we really care?
I mean, I sure won't, because as long as I die first, it's not my problem.
I mean, I'm sure you would care, like, if it blew up for your kids.
But it's an interesting question about how we value the environment. It brings us back to that thing, like, do we just value it for how we plan to use it while we're here, or do we value it because of some sort of appreciable right of existence in nature? And I don't want to get all spiritual, but some of us sort of like the idea of a world surviving beyond us. And the nuclear waste thing pretty much means that unless somebody comes up with a really interesting idea, that problem will survive us. Outlive us.
animals are small, and then like new radioactive eating species will come up.
Yeah, I mean the bacteria that eats radioactivity will live. Yeah. Okay. So the only thing we have left is those study goals 1 through 8 from the movie you never saw. I'd like to quickly fill you in on these, at least until the bell. I reserve the right to put these on the test. So I'd like to very quickly answer at least a few of these. In the early 1970s, OPEC, which stands for Occidental Petroleum Exporter Countries, if anybody would like to Google which ones they are, I'd be curious. I think it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Venezuela joined recently, even though they're not technically Occidental. And there's a couple others, and those are the ones that worry about. Maybe Yemen, maybe not? If anybody knows which other countries, I'd be very curious. Anyway, the OPEC cohort held back the petroleum that we thought we would buy from them in 1973. I believe it was right before the holidays.
Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, India, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE.
What were the first two? Those are the ones I would have thought of. Albania and Algeria?
Algeria, Angola.
And Angola. You said Nigeria is there. You said UAE. Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia.
Indonesia, Qatar.
Indo? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, back to me. OPEC said you guys can't have the petroleum after all, and the United States ground to a halt. We scrambled to rebuild those political allegiances. Some of you might know that Saudi Arabia was recently outed as our secret drone base in the Middle East. So all those drones that do that low visibility targeted killing of Al-Qaeda higher-ups, and whoever else will never know, apparently that base is in Saudi Arabia, which was supposed to be a big national